Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Healthy Planet Action Coalition workshop and seminar this morning. We're very pleased to have Peter Fiekowsky speaking, and in a moment he'll introduce himself with his experience. I could do that, but it's best if he just gives us a short summary. We're very pleased to have everyone here. We're an international group as usual. Robbie, myself and Brian are all in Australia. And I believe Paul is in the UK. John and Micah and Peter are all in the US, and we're very pleased to have everyone here today. Peter, would you like to start your workshop now, please?
Sure. Well, Rebecca, thank you. This is wonderful to be on with HPAC. I actually haven't met a number of you people before, which is always delightful. So for people on the recording and you who don't know me yet, I'm Peter Fiekowsky, and I founded the field of climate restoration. And by training, I'm a physicist from MIT. I'm an entrepreneur here in Silicon Valley with a software business in semiconductor manufacturing, which I don't do much in anymore. And I have 27 patents. And been working as a volunteer really the last 30, 40 years for poverty reduction, hunger, and then over the last 12 years to restore the climate. And I live in Silicon Valley, and I founded about 4 or 5 different nonprofits relevant to different aspects of restoring the climate. And so, the way I got into this field was many decades ago, I decided that my mission in life is to leave a world that we're proud of to our children. And at the time, it seemed like the hardest problem to deal with was global poverty and hunger. And so I had spent my volunteer time doing that, and was fortunate to work with a group which was instrumental in making sure that children around the world got vaccinated, and we got the funding through Congress to do that back in the 80s. And we worked with Mohammed Yunus to get microfinance going globally in the 90s and early 2000s, and worked in conjunction with the Republican Party to get treatment for AIDS going globally. So all of those things I was incidental in. I call myself a spear carrier in those operas, but phenomenal impact. And I learned that you can actually change the world if you don't try too hard. And so by 2010, I was very clear that this phenomenal progress in hunger and poverty was coming to an end, that we had cut the rate of preventable child deaths by a factor of 4 in just about 20 years. And but of course, everything was hold on, someone just asked me for the link to this. Let's do that and that and okay. And so I realized that we had to, that the most critical thing, and nothing else was going to make any difference if we didn't restore the climate. Now, in 2010, the term hadn't been invented, restoring the climate. We had to figure out what the problem was. Because it turns out that, of course, the problem is CO2 in the air, but reducing emissions, what is really critical and has to be done, and it is going to be done inevitably. But reducing emissions isn't going to restore the climate to what it was in the past. And so what turned me around was a dinner with the bishop at one of the COPs. And he talked about the morality of the climate and pointed out that I realized that what's important about the climate is humanity. That for science, climate is a really interesting problem. And for economics, it's a really great opportunity to make money. But for us as parents, it's a life and death thing, because there's, why have kids if they're just going to die due to floods like in back of Rebecca's picture there. And so, but once we realized that the climate was only a problem for humanity, then the question was really easy to answer. What do we do? Well, we restore CO2 back to what it was when humanity developed over the last 12,000 years. And that's where I'll start. Let me share my screen. And off we go. So, as we walk into this, I'm intending this to be a somewhat controversial topic, and I have to say I'm a little disappointed that we only have a handful of people at the moment. This is really about our children. It's not about the science. The science is very exciting, and there's billions of dollars going into it. Our children are worried, and if you have children, you can ask them. So the HPAC has had a big focus on global cooling or solar radiation management. And what's controversial about what I'm going to discuss is, although that's important, I'm going to argue that there's a problem, and we need to put everything in context. So ending the climate crisis requires removing 1 trillion tons of CO2. And I'll discuss that in a moment, but I think most of you are familiar with that fact. Solar radiation management, SRM, can accelerate cooling and reduce suffering as we reduce CO2 levels. And that's very clear. And that's why I think the advocates for marine cloud brightening and other techniques are very excited about it, because it can definitely reduce suffering. However, solar radiation management risks being a moral hazard. The moral hazard isn't about emissions, it's the moral hazard about distracting action and funding from restoring safe CO2. Just as marine cloud brightening has almost no budget yet, it sounds like there's some coming. CO2, the kind of CO2 removal which actually can reduce CO2 levels, also has almost zero funding. And that we need to make sure that before we get funding for solar radiation management, we have to make sure that CO2 removal at the proper scale gets funding. Because without safe CO2 levels, ocean collapse is likely within 1 to 2 decades. So that's the bottom line. Quick reiteration of climate restoration. We all want to give our children a safe climate like the one we were given, and that means restoring CO2 back to levels of 30 or 100 years ago. Very simple concept. Really, it doesn't require much more. I'll show you the graphs in a second. Nature has removed the needed amount of CO2 many times in the last million years, and sometimes at the rates that we need. So if nature can do it, we can do it too, and we can do it by 2050. And then, as I said, global cooling might buy us time, but it might not, because if we don't restore CO2 levels and eliminate ocean acidification, it's likely that we'll have some unimaginable ocean collapse. Now, it might not be bad, but of course it might be terrible. So the best strategy is to accelerate natural CO2 removal and develop the tech to accelerate cooling. So, one might ask, why is climate restoration such a tricky thing to hear about? And the answer is it's a paradigm shift. Our climate paradigm was established around 1980, and it says we have to eliminate emissions. And indeed, if in the 70s and 80s we had eliminated emissions, the climate would be just fine by now. It would still be just fine. It's a notable historical fact that we didn't eliminate emissions, and CO2 is now almost 50% higher than any level that humans have survived long term. And that's a bad thing we call that playing Russian roulette with our children. They might be fine, but they might not, and we don't. That's not acceptable. So let's see. Yeah, you can read the rest of that. But we're the main thrust here is changing the goal and the paradigm to restore and stabilize greenhouse gas levels. And so we need scientists to tell the UN that's what our goal needs to be. Because we have a vicious cycle here where policymakers say, well, we follow the scientists, and the scientists say we need to eliminate emissions. The scientists say, well, I'm not a policymaker, and the policymaker says to reduce emissions. And then the policymaker says, well, I'm not a scientist, but the scientist says we have to eliminate emissions. And no one ever thinks about the fact that that's not enough to ensure our children survive. So I think most of us have seen this graph. This is from Jim Hansen last year, and it really demonstrates the correlation between temperature and CO2. Now, we all know that in our hearts, but if you read the literature, you'll hear people talking about clouds and methane and ozone and sulfates, and you would think that it's too complicated to understand. But if you look at the last 800,000 years, you'll see that the lower temperatures correlate with lower CO2. If you want to reduce temperatures, reduce CO2. Yes, other things might work. We know that volcanoes will cool the planet for a year or year and a half. It probably would last a long time, but probably is not the way we deal with our kids. We do know that long-term CO2 is the way to go. And you want to have backup solutions like solar radiation management. I love this graph because this is telling us where we want to go. This is home. Over the last 10, 12,000 years, CO2 has been around 280, 270, 280. And this is where agriculture developed, Moses, Jesus, and so on. This is where we want to go back to. Whenever you're doing a project that you want to succeed, you need to be very clear what success looks like. If I want to get into college, I picture that acceptance letter from the college. Okay, another graph that almost everyone on this list has seen many, many times, and it's very exciting. It's sort of the same as the last one, but it's got more text on it. So 300 parts per million is the highest level humans have ever survived long term. And I think this was done several years ago. I think these days people say humans evolved around here, but it's, evolution is a continuing cycle. The several key points. One is, of course, we're way up here. The UN is saying we should target this level, which is crazy, but that's because there's that circular logic where the scientists echo the policymakers and policymakers echo the scientists, and all of that started back in 1980. And of course, in 1980, CO2 levels were way down here, barely above a dangerous level. The other thing to notice is that nature has removed 1,000 gigatons over and 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 over. So we know it's possible because it's been done. And I think all of us agree that the laws of physics haven't changed since the last time there was an ice age. And so we can probably do the same thing nature did. And so interestingly, and I came up with this data. Of course, you're familiar with the Keeling curve. This is 1958 when it started, and I guess this one was pulled out several years ago. But in Mount Pinatubo erupted right in here, and so this is a zoom into that, looking at the work that Scripps has done to take out the annual trend or the monthly trend, so you can see the deviations. And you can see CO2 after the Mount Pinatubo eruption. Now you see a big burst of CO2, which is normal before volcanic eruptions. And you see a reduction in CO2 after that. But then you see a stable almost 14 months of net zero. And this is not widely known and is in a certain sense inexplicable. That is to say, I've sometimes claimed that, or often claimed that it's probably due to ocean fertilization. And the oceanographers say it can't be because there's not enough nutrients in the ocean to do that. And I see Brian, Dr. von Hertzen here. He and I were discussing this yesterday, in fact, and he pointed out that when you have enough iron, you actually get production of nitrogen, although it takes 3 months or so for the bacteria that produce the nitrogen to multiply enough. And so that may explain why there was a period of increasing CO2 and then it stabilized when the cyanobacteria in the region of the volcano reached a high enough level and provided the nutrients that are said to not be there. Of course, they aren't there yet, but nitrogen, as you know, is the most common element in our part of our atmosphere. 80% of the air is nitrogen. And so converting that into nitrates just requires nitrogen fixing. Now, if you look over the long period, that last zoom would leave some people asking, well, if you looked at it differently, what do you see? And so here we have 12 years before, and you can see I just fit a straight line. You can see CO2 overall going up at a pretty continuous rate, which is proportional to emissions. If you correlate this with emissions reports from from NOAA or anyone like that, the rate matches it. Then you can see after the eruption, the emissions, the CO2 goes up at about the same rate, but there's an offset, and that offset is 20 gigatons of CO2. So it's very compelling. Now, some scientists say, listen, if you look at a certain area, if you just look at a couple of years, then you can have questions. So, for example, in 1998, there was a huge El Nino, and when you have a large El Nino, you get a spike in CO2, and then afterwards you get a lull in CO2, and you get I think the same thing here. But the point being that I think most of us agree now that CO2 that the CO2 level is proportional to emissions, and that's the assumption here, minus removals. And so this is very profound because 20 gigatons per year is 5 times more than oceanographers claim that ocean fertilization can do. So something happened, and it's the way we say it now is it's not conventional ocean fertilization by definition, because by definition, conventional ocean fertilization is limited to 4 gigatons per year. So this is something else other than conventional fertilization. We need to know what it is, but whatever it is, it's definitely reproducible. Now, the benefit of removing CO2. So Shannon Fiume did this modeling for us a few years ago, and she took the MAGIC program that the IPCC uses, and you may recognize this as just their standard output. And she took this top gray line is the best pathway from the 2013 IPCC report. This one is the best output from the 2017, I think, IPCC report. And then this dotted line, of course, is restoration. And so she just simply set the parameters to get us to 300 parts per million by 2050. And so this isn't a model of what would happen if. this is, if you want to get this result, how do you do it? And the answer is, she just, what worked, given the ocean modeling and so on, was removing 60 gigatons per year. And then she set it to remove 30 gigatons per year through the end of the decade, end of the century. Page 11. We were talking about the heat, which I suspect is the reason we have 99-degree heat here in Silicon Valley today. My Wi-Fi went out. So, but a couple of weeks ago in New Delhi, the high was 109 Fahrenheit, and I'll do my little conversion here, which is 45 degrees Celsius, and the low was 97. Which is 37 degrees. And that was the low for 2 or 3 days in a row, which is just intolerable. And the point is, as spokespeople for climate, I suggest that we have to stop even aligning with the idea of net zero, because it's simply unacceptable for us to advocate for that kind of weather for our children. Have to advocate for restoring a safe climate, restoring CO2 level that humans have survived. Okay, so here we've got the CO2 level, and as I was saying before my computer went out, before my Wi-Fi went out, that you can see, probably like orient myself my little phone here. You can see that with the climate restoration, CO2 gets to 300 by 2050 and temperature gets to 0. And that was the design of it. And then this allows us to ask the question, how do we get 60 gigatons of CO2 out per year? Because that's what allows this performance. And the answer to that is, as you saw on the previous slide, that nature took out 20 gigatons per year, and that was just essentially after throwing a few gigatons of dirt into the air. And the graph disappeared. Is it gone? Or is it just my phone? Okay, maybe it's my phone. Okay. And then looking at it as an engineering problem, when you're designing something, you always want to start with what's worked before. And we saw that over the ice ages, we know that ocean fertilization has worked before, and that needs to be the first priority. Now, in fact, it became the last priority for political reasons that I don't think we want to take too much time on, but it's purely political reasons. And if you look at the dynamics of ocean fertilization, and I don't have any good graphs on that at the moment on this deck, but with ocean fertilization, it's simply a matter of adding iron to the right parts of the ocean at the right time. Nature does that with dust. If you think about it, we know that all life requires iron. And in the deep ocean, there's essentially no iron because the iron falls out of solution. It doesn't dissolve well and goes to the seafloor. So the only source of iron in most of the ocean is dust storms, volcanoes, and sometimes whales, which will dive deep and then bring the iron up with them when they poop. And to replicate that is really quite easy. Iron dust is almost free, and the ships to distribute it are very inexpensive. This is something that people forget. If you leave out the cost of measuring carbon in the various steps, measuring oxygen, measuring all the other things that the scientists need to measure to make a believable report, if your goal is just to do what nature did and restore CO2, then it comes out to about a penny per ton of CO2 removed. And that's something we can afford. The numbers on that is for each American, it's about a penny a day. Or if you look at 1%ers, then that's $1 per day for the 1%ers in the US alone. And that'll pay for providing the iron in the right place in the right time. Now, as you saw in that earlier graph on the Pinatubo pause, we're not exactly sure what the right place and the right time is. We need to figure that out. But that we have a good start, and we're starting on a project just offshore of Mount Pinatubo to replicate it and figure out as quickly as we can how to do that. So let me get down to
Peter,
yeah. Okay, so what's the roadmap?
Sorry, they're not, excuse me, they're not moving.
I see it.
There you are. Okay, good. Okay, good.
Okay. Yeah. So this is the roadmap, and we'll distribute the deck. Basically, there are 4 steps. 2024. The important part here is to separate the physical and the political and financial aspects. And if you combine them, it's very confusing. So on the physical side, we need to start replicating the 1992 net zero event. And as I said, we're doing that in the Philippines. The Philippine Coast Guard has offered to do that for us. So that means they'll get the permits, and it'll be working with fishery restoration as well. So that for a developing country, we don't expect anyone to oppose working to improve fisheries in a developing country. And I'm not going to discuss methane oxidation because we don't have time, but we can discuss that another time. Methane oxidation is also important. Then in this year, establish on the political side, establish the legitimacy. So we're in the process of getting a congressional resolution introduced into the American Congress, and our goal is to have the U.S. president. If it's Biden for now, and we don't know who will win in November, but to have him declare that the U.S. is committed to restoring a safe climate, and that the evidence shows so far will be enough to convince scientists and policymakers to say that we will focus on restoring a safe climate, not just stabilizing. By 2026, it's about scaling and engaging. And so we can scale the CO2 removal to the 1992 level. In 92, it was about 500 kilometer region that was affected. And that's not too, we're starting with 100-kilometer diameter. So it's not a huge scale up, but you do it slowly to make sure there aren't any surprising side effects, and it's optimized. And then also in the next 2 years, we will be building up the funding. And it's important to realize the funding is not likely to come from governments. Governments do not have a stake in the well-being of unborn generations. We as parents do, but governments don't. And so the funding, the fundamental funding, the basis of the funding has to be from parents and grandparents. And we've created a grandparents fund to start that process up. I'm expecting there'll be other funding similarly. But if you think about it, Bill Gates, for example, as a grandparent, is very interested in this. As a large stockholder in Microsoft, he's not so interested. He wants his Microsoft stock to earn him money. But the trick is to get people to invest in this. And as I said, it's $1 a day per person per American as parents. And then at the moment, there are no government organizations that are chartered to make sure that our children survive. And so we've established an initial one we call the Climate Restoration Safety and Governance Board. And it's designed to develop a model that a government organization could adopt, which is focusing on making sure our children survive. And it's natural that there isn't anything yet, because in the history of humanity, in the history of our planet, it's never been needed before. CO2 levels are going up 10 times faster than they ever have to our knowledge in the history of our planet, other than after maybe some large volcano. And so we're getting down to the bottom here, 2030, our goal is to be operating CO2 removal at this required 60 gigatons per year, which modeling tells us is what we'll need. We'll learn things, whether it's 40 gigatons or 100 gigatons, doesn't change things very much. And then by 2050, you saw the modeling tell us that we will get CO2 below 300 and warming and safe levels below half. And let's go to the next slide. 13. Next slide. There we go. So back to global cooling. So people talk about global cooling, that it would buy us time. It probably won't. And the reason is this, that ocean acidification is results from CO2 levels. CO2 levels have gone up 35%, and so has acidification. That's what causes it. And so until we reduce CO2 levels, we won't reduce acidification. And it's already been found that a lot of fisheries are beginning to collapse because of the acidification. That shellfish more and more can't grow because the acid level is too high in the ocean. And so I'm going to skip the rest of this for the moment. Well, the other aspect of global cooling, which is risky, is it needs to be pursued. There's no question about that, but it's risky. Whereas we know that CO2 can be removed quickly, and so we want to make sure that there's funding going to CO2 removal with the solar radiation management. There is intense resistance, and there hasn't been much testing of it, and there are no co-benefits. So with ocean fertilization, you have fisheries that are helped because the algae, the phytoplankton, is food for the fish. And for the most part, to my knowledge, with solar radiation management, you don't have those co-benefits. And the other thing is that it would take a decade or two to scale up. So to wrap things up quickly, I'll just do this last one. Next slide, common myths. The first myth is that we're buying time. And the question is, we're buying time for what? And until people adopt a restoration goal, they're just buying time for buying more time. Right, because the idea of net zero is it buys us time, and so the first priority is to adopt climate restoration as a goal. Second myth: we're providing information for decision makers, and the fact is that there are no decision makers. There's no institution chartered to make our planet survivable, and it's terrible, but it's true. And so we have tens of thousands of articles being written every year to provide information for decision makers, but there's no one in a position to provide funding to restore the climate. And that's hopefully going to change in the next year, but it's important to be aware of that. There's a myth that stopping emissions is critical to the climate. And of course, that was true in the 1970s and even 1980. But at this point, if we accelerate the energy transition by 25%, that would reduce the atmospheric CO2 that we need to remove by only 5%, and that's not significant. It's good to do, but it's not critical. The myth: there's no silver bullets, only silver buckshot. The fact is that nature over millennia uses only iron fertilization to remove 100 parts per million rapidly of CO2. And that's what I would consider a silver bullet. That's the only method, and it's really cheap. And so when people say that there are no silver bullets, you have to ask, why are they saying that? And then finally, the solution must be market-based. This is the last one that I had got out of myself because I'm a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. But the problem is that the market cares about investors. And so any company is going to make sure they make a profit. The company doesn't have children. The owners might. So with that, I'll end. And again, let's just zip up to slide 3. Whoops. That's the right one. Yeah. And global cooling is best used alongside CO2 restoration. And yeah, we'll skip the other slides for now. Okay, and we'll take questions. Go up to 3.
Thanks so much, Peter. What we'll do is I will moderate. If people want to put up their hands, please, via the chat, the raise hand function, or if for some reason you're on an iPhone and you can't do that, if you wave your hand, I'll see it, and we'll try and do it in order. And we're very fortunate. We've got some real technical wizards, I'll just call them that, or scientific experts in Brian and Mike, and I'm sure Carol and yourself as well. Other than that, it's very, very user-friendly and or accessible, I should say. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, and let's have some discussion. John, you have got your hand up first.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was a great presentation. The idea that there would be no co-benefits from blocking out the energy of the sun or keeping it from striking the surface of the ocean is hard to square with the idea that in the testing of animal life in the coral area, you have both a temperature problem and you have the acidification problem. And in all the research I've seen, the temperature problem is the major problem and amplifies the acidic effects on the chemistry of what's being lost. So if we were to interrupt the arrival of, let's say, 1.5 watts per meter square incoming energy to the surface of the ocean, and we started the surface to cool, or at least not heat as quickly, the co-benefits are massive. And I mean, just the one I've mentioned is just one of many co-benefits. If the glaciers stop melting or slow down, then we have more reflective surfaces to send back more energy. Forests wouldn't be as hot, and therefore their soils wouldn't dry out as quickly and they wouldn't burn as easily. So the co-benefits of interrupting the extra energy arrival to the surface is vast, I think. And so I think the no co-benefits thing might be something you want to look at.
Yeah. So that's a very good point. What you're saying is that there are a lot of benefits to restoring the climate. And of cooling the climate, and of course that's true. The thing to remember is that most of the populace believes the UN, right? The UN says our goal is to reduce emissions, and so insofar the UN doesn't say anything about reduce. Well, it tells people that our goal is to reduce emissions, and so if you're going to do something that doesn't reduce emissions, such as ocean fertilization or solar radiation management, then it's wise to have a co-benefit. So with ocean fertilization, the co-benefit is fisheries. Of course, solar radiation management cools the planet, but that's not what the UN calls for yet. Now, hopefully that'll change very rapidly. Right? The UN calls for reducing emissions. Anyway, that's the point, is that the people who are going to argue against solar radiation management, they say it's a false solution because it does not reduce emissions. That's all.
Right.
It's politics.
But this is your presentation, and you've put up the word no co-benefits. That makes you a proponent of no co-benefits in your own presentation. I'll leave it to the UN to.
I'll change it.
Well,
Thanks.
you know what you could do, Peter, because obviously this is a hugely interesting thing to those people who are, I'm in the Reed Brighton group, as you know, and you could say perception of no co-benefits, because it's all about the community acceptance. But anyway,
Yes.
thank you for the discussion.
Beautiful.
Mike is next.
Oh, thanks. Well, Peter, very interesting. I guess I'll say first, I disagree with most of your comments on SRM, but I want to talk about, your proposal itself. So it's interesting what you say about El Chichon. That's kind of basic to what you're proposing. Are there other volcanic eruptions that show that? Is sort of one part of the question I have. It doesn't look like El Chichon had a similar effect. Now that was a different kind of volcanic eruption, but it was low latitude. And so I'd be interested in your comment on that, but also one of the other very interesting pauses in the rise in the CO2 concentration that shows in the ice core records is that during World War II, the CO2 concentration hardly rose at all. It's kind of intriguing why. And I know a number of others have tried to figure out what that might be, because if you can really stall a CO2 concentration through the World War II, how in the world did that happen? And I'm not sure there's agreement on it, but one of the very interesting things that happened, and it may have happened in earlier history as well in various times, is that basically lots of farmers went to fight as soldiers. That's what happens in war. You take the poor and the farmers off the field and you send them into war. And so the farms are now not tended, and they tend to regrow and pull a lot of carbon out. And so I guess I'm wondering, there are explanations about Pinatubo, whether that was also an effect on land growth of vegetation due to more light getting down below the canopy from the diffuse light and stuff. How can we be really convinced that it's the ocean that's doing these things? I should say the other earlier one that was interesting was the invasion of the Americas when the Spanish came in, and all the a whole bunch of native people died of smallpox and everything like that. And so they basically it was again loss of tremendous numbers of farmers, and lots of regrowth occurred and pulled carbon down and some things. It seems there's real evidence it can happen on land, but how strong is this evidence really that it can happen in the ocean? The model, I was just on SCORE looking at some of these experiments, and very few of the experiments are done well enough to really justify the conclusion that it'll be long-term sequestration.
Yeah. Oh, Mike, those are great questions. I'll take them one at a time. So you asked about El Chichon, and that question is framed around, we do see on the Keeling curve, the plateau in 1992. So I think you're not arguing that that's not real. And so then the question is, you asked, well, how about other volcanoes? El Chichon in 1983, Agung, which is Bali, Santa Maria in 1902, and Krakatoa in 1880-ish, whatever it was, 82. And interestingly, none of those had a significant CO2 impact. Really, it's only only Pinatubo. Now we only have good data for the three, Agung, I'll call it Bali, El Chichon, which is in Mexico, and Pinatubo. El Chichon is essentially landlocked. The wind blew the dust, the ash along the land, so it didn't reach the ocean until about 1,000 miles later. And so a good explanation for that is that very little fertilization got into the ocean, and that could explain why the cooling was the same as Pinatubo, but the CO2 reduction wasn't. And I don't remember if I made the point that in Pinatubo, there was the cooling due to aerosols in the stratosphere. And separate from that, there was the ash falling into the ocean, fertilizing the ocean. Now, so the first thing we see is that there was something particular about Pinatubo of the 5 fairly recent ones, and especially the 3 that happened since the Keeling curve. And the thing that I found that seems most likely is that it was in the ocean, and it was it was on an island with a downwelling eddy, that most of the ash fell into a large downwelling eddy in the South China Sea. The other interesting thing is a lot of people say, well, I think it was the cooling, right? Because we all know a lot, physicists know that when you cool water, it will absorb more CO2. So we know that as the ocean cooled off by 0.5 degree, more CO2 went into the ocean. But the amount of that is about, if I recall, less than 1% of the CO2 removed during Pinatubo, if you just mathematically do it. And then, as I said, the other volcanoes, which had the same amount of cooling, produced essentially no CO2 removal. So then that leaves the one that you asked, which is, well, what about land? That is, the ash will fall on land. Won't you get some extra vegetation growing in the land? And you certainly do get some. In the Philippines, the amount of fertilizer that they use has gone down since the eruption, because there was minerals in the ash. But 2 things. One is if you calculate, and it's in my paper on the Pinatubo pause, if you calculate how much plant life needs to grow, basically the trees in the Philippine area would have to have increased in diameter by 1 foot in that year. And it's unlikely that it happened, because if it had, that would have been reported, and that was not reported, and would still be visible. And then, because you have to remember, this is planet ocean, not planet Earth. There's not that much land. And the amount of ash that fell as close as the Vietnam, the winds were blowing from Pinatubo to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, it was just, I forget the term that the reports used, but a very, very, very fine dusting. So those are the arguments, and there's more detail, of course. Oh, the final very important one is that, as you saw in the graph on the multi-decade graph on the Pinatubo, it was a long-term removal, and most plant growth is annual. The leaves and the fruits and so on, only a little bit of it goes into the trunks of trees and into the deep roots. And so it would have shown it. The other volcanoes, if it made a difference, it would have shown up as long-term. Okay, sorry, that's all. I hope that wasn't too long an answer for you. Oh, then you asked about World War II, and that's a good question. I look forward to your answers. I was hoping you wouldn't say, I'm glad you didn't say, maybe we should just do World War III, because that would definitely end global warming. But let's not do that.
Thanks, Peter. We'll move along to Brian.
Greetings. I wanted to provide a quick response to Mike McCracken. There's been a lot of questions over the years about the duration of carbon removals in the surface ocean. What we've identified with our marine permaculture platforms are that we've identified sink rates for tropical seaweeds exceeding 1,000 meters per day, which gets us down to abyssal ocean water depths in a period of 1 to 4 days is our typical time scale. So it's very short, and there's a lot of export. And typically what happens is that seaweed gets eaten by benthic organisms and actually addresses some of the problems of reduced marine snow that's occurred and reduced biogenic inputs in the subtropical oceans over the past 6 decades. And so in the subtropics, at least, restoring that food supply is essential for those benthic ecosystems. Furthermore, those benthic communities eat the seaweed, turn it into carbon dioxide again. And that carbon dioxide reacts with marine sediments at depths ranging from 1,000 to 3,500 meters. And it converts calcium carbonate into calcium bicarbonate, which is dissolved and has a typical lifetime in the ocean of 100,000 years. So that appears to be a significant mechanism that will need to be scaled through some of the cultivation programs we're doing for macroalgae. It also applies to some extent to microalgae. But what's significant here is there's also a significant contribution to kelp forests, or from kelp forests. With outwelling and downwelling, they also contribute to this flux. And so we're looking forward to quantifying those better and also seeing how we can scale food security for humanity and 8 million other species and document the seaweed that falls off. Roughly 20 to 40% falls off platforms during growth, and like leaves falling from a tree, they sink to the seafloor where they in fact go through this calcium bicarbonate process. So happy to go into more details, but just wanted to provide a quick analysis of some long-term sequestration potential with calcium bicarbonate through this natural biogenic process.
Great, thank you.
Pleasure.
I might jump in, I think. So thanks so much, Peter. That was just a really brilliant presentation. I think the thing that I take from it is just the critical importance of ocean acidification as a climate concern, and the issue being that direct climate cooling can affect temperature, but can't directly affect the acidification of the ocean. And so those really, that you've got two key issues: temperature and acidification. And the question that I've wondered about, and I just haven't seen a clear answer on, is the actual scale of the risk of acidification. And you're saying that it's a risk of ocean system collapse in coming decades, and really that does illustrate the extreme urgency of the carbon problem. But I suppose I just put it as equally alongside that, the albedo problem is that the co-benefits of restoring albedo are a mitigation of extreme weather and biodiversity loss and sea level rise, but also the risk of systemic disruptions. And in particular, I think the role of cooling in preventing polar methane release is really significant, because if we don't do cooling, then we're at risk of these unknown tipping points just swamping all of our carbon efforts. So the two really need to go alongside. So thanks so much again. And if you have any reflections on those points, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, Robert, I totally agree that we have to do them together. And yeah, not much else to say about that. In terms of acidification, in 2 years ago, in 2022, there was a collapse of the Alaska's snow crab. And that was expected because of the acidification, that experts had seen the acidification increase. They predicted right around the middle of the 2020s would be the end of the Alaskan snow crab, and that's exactly what happened. And what's interesting is the scientific community looked at various causes of it, and I haven't published this anywhere, but if you just Google it, the 6 causes that they investigated, and I'll put this in my deck, is directed fishing. They checked bycatch and commercial trawls, cannibalism, predation from Pacific cod, disease, increased temperatures. They didn't even investigate pH increase, acidification as the cause of the expected collapse. And I think they're just afraid of dealing with this seemingly impossible problem. Anyway, but the fisheries are collapsing already, and I've read reports that various kinds of phytoplankton and fish nymphs are also suffering.
So I think we're up to Robbie's question now. Is that right? Or are we up to John again?
Jonathan.
John again.
Hey, thank you. Did you look at the pandemic? And in 2020 for the year, there was estimated to be a 5.4% drop in human emissions of CO2. And during parts of the year, there was months where it was as high as 17%. Did you study at all to see if that affected the measurements of global CO2 concentrations from Hawaii, for instance, in order to get yourself an estimate of, well, what if we do something with the oceans that absorbs an amount equivalent to 5 or 15% of human emissions? How much might we see? Did you look at the pandemic at all?
Yeah, the math is fairly simple, Jonathan. That the amount of CO2 in the air is the amount that's added minus the amount removed, and there wasn't much change in removals. And indeed, the rate of CO2 increase went up. It was 5% slower. So yeah, that confirmed what we would expect, that CO2 in the atmosphere is an accumulation of what's been emitted minus what's been removed. Was that your question?
Sort of. I really had hoped to see a change in the Keeling curve, and putting up today's version of it is we don't see a lot of change if we go back to the 2020, 2021. If I zoom in on it, it's like, where's the change? So that change in emissions, that enforced reduction of human emissions by the shutdown of industry and transport, doesn't seem to show up in the graph anywhere. So one has to question, like you said in your talk, on one of your slide entries, you said, working on reducing emissions is not a really effective way to reduce temperature. And I think this graph, backs that up, that 5, 10, 20% reduction in emissions probably won't even show up in a measurable way.
Yeah, that well said, Jonathan. Thank you. Yeah. The way I like to say it is, reducing emissions, saying that reducing emissions is vital, is sort of like saying eating breakfast and breathing are vital. Of course they're vital, but you're going to keep on doing it. And reducing emissions is going to happen for sure, whether it's by conversion to electric vehicles and processes or by humans going extinct. Either way, we are going to reduce emissions.
Thanks, Peter. I think we're up to Robbie. I would like to encourage the newcomers, if you've got any questions, please don't be shy. It's a great conversation. We've got about 19 minutes left. So at the end, Peter or even Carol will invite you to do a wrap up, but let's keep going with a question from Robbie.
Mike was next.
Mike, I'm sorry.
I just wonder, Peter, if you could talk about what you expect would happen from this to fish life and marine life and sort of food productivity from putting so much iron in the ocean. I mean, would it create tremendous sources of marine protein for the world?
Yes. You would. It's a great question. So you're asking, if you do ocean fertilization at scale, how much would that improve fisheries? And it depends on doing it right. And there haven't been a lot of studies. In fact, there haven't really been any completed studies on how to use ocean fertilization to improve fisheries. It's intuitively obvious that if you feed fish, they'll grow faster. And the fishery industries, they talk about how fish are getting skinnier and fewer. So feeding them, of course, is going to help. The second perspective on that, Mike, is that Mont Pinatubo affected less than 0.1% of the ocean, and that gave us a 20 gigaton removal. If you do a crude extrapolation, say, well, we need to triple that amount of removal to get back to safe levels by 2050, then that comes up to about 1/3% of the ocean. Now, if it's done just to optimize CO2 removal, and then it might not have much impact on fisheries. On the other hand, it wouldn't be that difficult to make sure that the iron application is done in the best places, both for CO2 removal and for fisheries, because doing adding iron in the Southern Ocean, for example, is definitely good for CO2 removal, but there's not that much fishing done down there, as far as to my understanding. Whereas in the South China Sea with Vietnam and Indonesia and China and so on, there's a lot of fishing, and so improving, doing the iron fertilization there makes a big difference.
Thanks, Peter. Robbie, I think it's your turn now.
Peter, I'd like to explore the psychological and social barriers that you're experiencing in trying to get what seems to me a very simple message across. And it's like, to me, it's simply astonishing that the very clear questions about the future of humanity and the world that you're discussing just seem to hit a brick wall, like it's like a wall of silence that people just don't seem to care about the future. I find it astonishing, and it's like there's a need for a paradigm shift of some sort, and so defining the nature of that paradigm shift is something that just really needs a lot more conversation. And one of the things that I've been reflecting on is, like, there are people who imagine an ideal sort of future where where all of the problems of the world are fixed, and there are also people who say, what is the first small thing that we need to do to start on a path towards those sort of ideals? And so I think that's it's the latter sort of approach that you're suggesting, but there's inevitably a combination, and so it's to me it's one of the key ideas is global thinking. That is, that we've evolved to have a sort of clan-based psychology and instincts, and shifting away from that very localized mentality is something that people just aren't able to cope with. So that then leads to these questions around what's the critical path, what's the sequencing that can open up that conversation, and so I think that seems to me to be where you're going, and I just appreciate if you would explore those questions a bit more. Thank you.
Robbie, I'd love it. What are the barriers to taking the very simple actions that we need to take? And my experience coincides with yours. That is sort of the tribal or clan thinking, and it's baked into being human. We wouldn't survive. We wouldn't have survived here if we didn't have that. Now, the neuroscience that I use, that perspective, says two things. One is that our actions are a function consistent with the future that we're expecting and that we're talking about. So it's not about what we're thinking about, what we're talking about. And so my understanding is during World War II, people talk about winning the war. It was all about winning the war. And that was the picture in our common brain, or our parents' common brains. Of course, that's the direction things went. They won the war. On climate, the language we use is climate disaster. And of course, all of our actions are obviously consistent with climate disaster because we're having a climate disaster. And if we change the language, the expectation that we're going to restore the climate, then people will say we're restoring the climate, just much as in World War II, we talked about winning the war. And then our actions will shift towards that goal. The thing is, our logical brain, our prefrontal cortex, evolutionarily is very new, and so we think that our thoughts are real, but they're just little thoughts in our brain. Our communication with each other is the real part, and so expanding the goal we want, and I created a field that I call I am humanity, which is just a way of being. So like, I'm an American, I'm a physicist. Each of those has a whole bunch of thoughts and behaviors and languages, brain patterns, as the neuroscience calls it, associated with that way of being. So with humanity flourishing, a natural way of being is being concerned and taking action to restore the climate and the environment. And then from that, it's obvious that we would want to restore the climate. So, but the trick is, the tribal thinking, we can get around it by just noticing that we have it. You can't stop it, just like I can't stop being sexually attracted when I'm sexually attracted. But once I realize, oh, I'm sexually attracted at certain times and it's inappropriate, then when I notice it, I can set it aside. And in the same way, our tribal or clan thinking, if we acknowledge that's natural, then we can set it aside and then replace it with humanity thinking.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Peter,
Makes me
what
very happy.
I'd like to add something there, if I may. I think the tribal, because Robbie and I work closely together, and with Brian as well, a number of us do here. The tribal thinking that we need is all the wonderful things that you've put on the screen about restoration. And then we need to think tribally. Nearly everybody thinks they want to do something. So we need to get over the fear of changing. We've been in net zero for 30 years, and for reasons that we all know, it hasn't worked properly. We're getting into climate removal now. I subscribe to Just Have a Think with Dave Borlace, and he's always talking about the wonderful things that are scaling up. They're not even on the verge, but they're starting to happen. But the tribal thinking is we need to do something different. And I think the value of this group, Healthy Planet Action Coalition, and the one that you're in as well, is that you're really testing the solutions. The discussion we've had here today about whether it will work, what's the science behind it, your ordinary person isn't going to do all that hard work. And so it would be quite easy to go along tribally and say, we want to do something, and if it didn't work, that would be no good. Anyway, I think we're all advocating consistent solutions, and probably most of them can happen together. But thanks very much for that, Carol, for inviting us to the Saturday to your workshop. Yeah. All right. So who else has got something else? We've got
Rebecca,
about 5.
Rebecca, let me build on what you said. Part of having our tribal brain is that when we're scared, we always blame the other tribe. So if you think about it, what's the difference between good and bad? Good is what we do, and bad is what they do, right? If you think about the various differences you have with people in your neighborhood or other neighborhoods. And so it's important to acknowledge that, and so in climate, we we instinctively blame other people. Yeah, so we blame the oil companies, we blame the capitalists, we blame, if you know me, I blame scientists, and I take it back. But it's my tribal brain says those, God damn it, they're smart. They should be thinking, they should realize that net zero is not what we need. But we're tribal. And so just again, honoring that tribal thinking allows us to set aside that they're the wrong and bring us back that we all want the same thing. And so it's creating a tribe of all of humanity, which is in parallel to being American and being Jewish and being a physicist and being a Californian and all the millions of other ways of being that I have and you have. So again, but Rebecca, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So one of the issues around tribal thinking is that the IPCC and the UN have a consensus around emission reduction as the sole objective, and so there's this idea that if only we can reduce emissions, it goes back to the point that you're making, Peter, about moral hazard, that the moral hazard of both direct climate cooling and also carbon dioxide removal is that it undermines the tribal consensus on emission reduction within the climate activist community, and so we do have this sort of irrational thinking. And that's the problem about being tribal, that it means that people put their emotions before their reason, and emotional connect. And so if we have an emotional view that if only we could cut our emissions, then we could save the world. If that emotion just completely overrides our ability to engage with evidence and logic, then the conversation just is excluded.
Yeah. No, Robbie, that it's so true. I look at what does it take to join the army, and to be in a battle, you have to change your brain a little bit so that you can justify killing someone else. And if you couldn't do that, then they would kill you, and your tribe would be gone. So we've all got that in our brain to be almost ready to kill someone else if they think differently than us. Now, when we own it, like, oh yeah, my brain is designed to want to kill that person. But once I realize that, it's like, okay, I'll set it aside and calm down, and then say, hey, let's work together on our common problem. But it's not, I don't think it's going to change. I think it's very hardwired, and we can acknowledge it and then set it aside. That tribal thinking, it's so automatic.
Well, in fact, I think what you're partly saying, Peter, is not set it aside, but use it for the good. And there are so many commonalities. Just to Bruce Melton has been telling me this morning that humour is a very good thing. So we're moving in towards wrap up now, and I'd like to say that I'm of Irish background, Celtic, and my partner is Hungarian, and like there's very many overlaps. So they're different tribes, but we managed to synergize, and our daughter really loves Hungarian folk music. And anyway, let's keep building up commonalities between the tribes, within and among as well. So would Carol or Peter, would you have any final comments just to wrap us up for today?
Well, just thank you everybody for the questions. I usually finish these talks happy, but I'm very happy at the depth of the discussion today. I think everyone is leaving with that we're all in it together. We all want the same thing, that we automatically get angry at the people who are taking a different approach. And I apologize to the people I annoyed at first, saying, well, global cooling is not the first choice. It needs to be in parallel with CO2. But my sense is that we've gotten over that hump. And let's keep going together. Carol, do you have anything else you want to add? It doesn't have to be.
Carol, you're on mute.
Yeah, it was great to see everyone. I've certainly seen your names. I would invite you to very, very warmly to come on Saturday, and also check out our blog on Substack, where we dive into some of these questions, like why haven't we ended the climate crisis yet? The ethical dilemma that's keeping us from doing that. I've added some links, and Robert, you really put your finger on it. We're always astonished that how why is this so why isn't everybody talking about this? So yeah, and all of our audiences say the same thing. So if I would love it if any of you have any ideas, let me know. And any new if you're in any other communities that would like and benefit from a presentation, whether it's clubs, university classes, meetups, what policy groups that you may be part of, please let us know.
Very kind indeed, Carol. And
Organizing.
yeah, wonderful.
So, Peter and Carol, you co-authored book. Could you just tell us a bit about your book?
Yeah, so the book is Climate Restoration, the only future that will sustain the human race. So you can see it's looking at what's the future so that people can see the future. Now, the book was written 3 years ago, and in the book we talk about what we call the big 4 solutions. Climate has gotten much worse in the last 4 years, and so now we're working exclusively on ocean fertilization, on getting the governance going, the Safety and Governance Board. I'm very excited about the new area of finance, of developing finance from grandparents, from parents, as opposed to trying to shoehorn the survival of humanity into corporations where corporations don't have children and the corporation just doesn't care. It's people care, but the corporation doesn't. And then, of course, methane. I think someone mentioned how important methane is, and just to take 40 seconds on that, if you probably know that nature oxidizes methane. Methane has a half-life of about 8 years in the atmosphere, and so we know how to double the oxidation rate using iron chloride, which is one of the chemicals that nature uses. And we have a very decent plan, which would also be less than $1 billion a year, to be able to oxidize excess methane, because we are in a methane burst. We're hoping hard that it won't be a serious methane burst, but given that temperatures are rising 10 times faster than in almost any recorded period, it might be a serious methane burst, and the methane oxidation will allow us to oxidize that methane globally before it causes a temperature spike, because it's the temperature spike that destroys and disrupts ecosystems. So that's the book. I recommend it. People who read it tell me it makes them very happy, that they find that they sleep much better, realizing that there's a pathway and people are working on it. And what I tell people is, those of us who have drunk the Kool-Aid and say, you know what, we are going to restore the climate, nothing's going to stop us. Right? Robbie, you and I have known each other for a lot of years, and I know that you're going to be here either until you die or until we get the job done. And it looks like we can get the job done by 2030. That is to get the CO2 falling at the rate we need by 2030.
Peter and Carol, thank you so much for joining our small group online today. Angel, I hope that you did get something out of it as a relative newcomer. You're welcome back to these Healthy Planet meetings. We have them every fortnight, and you can see there's a lot of good scientific meetings happening along with the ones that Peter and Carol run. And I'm on my iPhone, so I can't quite see everybody, but everyone who's been here today, we do thank you for being here. And Robbie, in a moment, if you could turn off the recording, please.